Wednesday of every month. HistoryLink is a wonderful resource as the largest free online encyclopedia of Washington state history. If you need a restroom, they'll be on the deli case and to the left. And if you find yourself sitting, again, towards the aisle, if as more people come in, you'd like to scoot more towards the wall, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And then a brief run of show. We'll have our lovely presenters, Al and Brad, speak, followed by a special guest appearance by John McFarlane, the grandson of Elise and Roy Olmstead. And then we'll have a Q&A. As we ground in the space, it's important to acknowledge that here at Mohi, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, with lasting impacts on the land, water, and people. Therefore, today, it's critical that we hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. Now, to introduce tonight's speakers. Albert Gidari is the author of Elise Olmstead, The Myth and Mystery of Seattle's Queen of the Bootleggers. He is also co-owner of Gidari Publishing, which was created to tell the stories of the Florentine resistance in World War II. Gidari is a technology lawyer and was the chair of data privacy practice at Perkins Coie Law Firm before retiring to teach at Stanford Law School and serve as the consulting director of privacy at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. When not searching for local historical artifacts, Brad Holden enjoys writing about the more illicit side of Seattle's past. He is a contributing writer for HistoryLink.org, and his work has also appeared in Seattle Magazine and several newspapers. Holden has been profiled on Cairo and Como News, Seattle Refined, NPR, King 5 Evening, and various publications. His trilogy of books related to the Prohibition era are available online and at bookstores everywhere. He lives in Edmonds, Washington. Please give them a warm round of applause.
All right, thank you all for being here tonight. My name's Brad Holden. I'm a local author and historian. And I am joined here tonight with Albert Gidari, who wrote a terrific book about Elise Olmstead. And so we're here to talk to you tonight about the royal couple of Seattle bootlegging, Roy and Elise Olmstead. And as they mentioned, it gets even better than that because we are also joined by Roy and Elise's grandson, John McFarlane. He's going to be joining us towards the end of the discussion to answer some questions about his experience, what it was like with Roy and Elise when he was a young boy. So Roy and Elise had a daughter, Patricia, John's mother. She's still alive, lives down in California. She celebrated her 100th birthday last summer. And we were originally hoping to get her to join us, but as it turns out, I guess when you're 100 years old, traveling to another state to come up on stage in front of a bunch of strangers at night, maybe isn't as cool as it once was. So she took a pass and, we understood. But we're thrilled to have John with us tonight. I'm going to go over Roy's, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what was going on here in Seattle during Prohibition, and then Roy's story, and then Al's going to talk about Elise. Because we're sharing the stage tonight, we're kind of limited for time, so if I skip over anything about Roy, and if you guys have any questions, save your questions for the end. We'll be happy to answer any questions. When you do, let us know who your question's for, which one of us on stage, so we can make sure and get the right person to answer your question. All right. Am I standing right in the front there? Let me stand over here. Yeah, and we got some great photos, never seen before photos of Roy that will be shown during my presentation. So let's just jump right into it. So first, what was going on here in Seattle during Prohibition? So, as some of you may or may not know, Washington State went dry in 1916. This was 4 years before the rest of the country did. And the main reason for this, well, there's actually a couple reasons for this. So the main reason is Seattle, probably starting after the Alaskan Gold Rush in the 1890s, was just a really kind of out of control place. It was one of the vice capitals of the world. And when I say that, I don't just mean there were a few saloons here and there. I mean, if you were to go to where Seattle, Pioneer Square, Georgetown, what was once downtown Seattle, filled, every street, every block filled with saloons, brothels, gambling parlors, box houses, opium dens, you know it, name it. Whatever you wanted was pretty much available down there. Now, at the same time that this was going on, nationwide, there was a saloon problem kind of going on nationwide. I don't have a lot of time to get into the hows and whys, but suffice to say, saloons had become a very social problem back then. And again, this was happening across the country. They were basically following the trains, and then they would open up in these small towns, and as soon as a saloon would open, all the bad statistics, the rates of divorce, the rates of domestic violence, the rates of arrest would all rise exponentially as soon as these saloons would open. So they were really kind of the social boogeyman of their time. And as a result of this, a grassroots movement took hold and emerged, the temperance movement, groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, the Prohibition Party, groups like this. They started out in the Midwest, but they spread throughout the country because, again, the saloon problem was problematic pretty much everywhere. And of course, like moths to a flame, they were really attracted to the big urban areas where there was a lot of vice. So naturally, Seattle got on their radar pretty fast, and they moved over here and set up operations and set up headquarters here in Seattle. They realized pretty early on, these temperance groups, that to really become effective, what they needed to do was be active at the political level. So they started out small. They started out holding these local option elections in which towns or cities could vote to go dry or not. And here in Western Washington, a lot of towns did vote to go dry. In Edmonds, where I live, they voted to go dry in 1910. Everett, at one point or another, kind of on and off, voted to go dry. Bellingham, I think Bothell, Federal Way, a number of places around here went dry leading up to Prohibition. At some point, the temperance groups were like, we're having so much success with these local option elections, let's take it even bigger and do it statewide. So a number of states, because of these temperance groups, started voting to go dry. I think Oklahoma was the first one, and then it just spread from there. Here in Washington, they put it on the ballot as Washington State Initiative number 3. Voters voted on it in the November 1914 elections, and passed by a pretty wide margin. And then the law actually went into effect January 1st, 1916. So this kind of spotlights one of the misconceptions about Prohibition, which is that a lot of people think, when you hear Prohibition, you think the Roaring 20s. And if you ask the average person, when was Prohibition, they're going to tell you the years of national prohibition, which is true. There's nothing wrong with that. But what a lot of people don't realize is there was a whole other era of prohibition before national prohibition, with all these states going dry because of the temperance groups. And the same thing would happen in these states is what happened at the national level with national prohibition, which is when the states would vote to go dry, alcohol is being outlawed, yet there's still a public demand for alcohol. So a black market emerged in all these different states to satisfy that demand. So you had this whole exciting era of prohibition before national prohibition with all the same stuff: speakeasies, bootleggers, moonshiners, corrupt cops, the whole 9 yards. There was also crime syndicates that emerged, just like in national prohibition, that were running these bootlegging rackets. Probably the biggest one was a group of 4 brothers, the Billingsley brothers. They started out in Oklahoma, and they pretty much just blazed a trail across the country. Their MO is they would wait until a state was about to go dry, and then they would move in, set up their bootlegging operation, make a ton of money, and then once the authorities kind of caught on what they were doing and the legal heat started building up, they would pull up stakes and then move to another state that was about to go dry, rinse and repeat. Well, as soon as Washington State went dry, they moved to Seattle in 1915, and they set up shop here in Seattle. So when Seattle went dry, January 1st, 1916, they were locked and loaded and ready to go. And they just turned the town upside down. And they were basically kind of Wild West outlaws, but they were Seattle's first wave of bootleggers. They're also the subject of my next book that I'm working on right now, by the way. So that's why bringing them up. So yeah, that was the first wave of Seattle bootleg, and was the Billingsley brothers here in Seattle. And then that led to national prohibition. So again, the temperance groups, the Women's Christian Temperance Union particularly, they started out small with the local option elections. Then they moved to the states, and all these states started going dry. And then they moved it and took it to the national level with the repeal of the 18th Amendment, and that led to national prohibition. But they were the driving force behind all that, so they just kept getting bigger and bigger. So national prohibition goes into effect 1920. So what was going on here is we see the second wave of bootleggers with Roy Olmstead. So initially, when Washington went dry here in Seattle, it was kind of quiet. There wasn't a lot going on. But the authorities here started hearing a buzz that there was a bootlegging operation going on. There was some legal liquor being smuggled here from Canada, and that it was being dropped off at a beach just a little north of where I live in Meadowdale Beach. So they decided to set up a stakeout in the woods at this Meadowdale Beach. And sure enough, the first night of their stakeout, a boat pulls up, then a truck full of guys pulls up and meets the boat, and they started loading a bunch of booze into their trucks. And all the cops that were doing the stakeout came out with their guns drawn, and everyone was under arrest. The gig was up. Well, included in that dragnet was one Roy Olmstead, who was a Seattle cop. It was a big deal then. So Roy Olmstead gets arrested 3 months after the beginning of national prohibition. Like I mentioned, he was a Seattle cop. He had been on the police force since 1907, when he joined. He was really bright and ambitious and just really smart, and he rose through the ranks really fast. I think within 6 or 7 years, he was a sergeant on the force. And by the time national prohibition went into effect, he was a lieutenant. So when he got arrested, he was a lieutenant on the force. And like a lot of other cops at the time, it was kind of well known that if you were a cop, you didn't make a lot of money. They were basically making the equivalent of like minimum wage. And it was really hard to raise a family on that. So a lot of cops, and this was again just kind of nationwide, it wasn't just here in Seattle, had side hustles. Some of the side hustles were on the legal side of things, most of them were not. A lot of bootlegging, including, that's what Roy Olmstead was doing, as kind of a side hustle. So when he got arrested, he got fired from the force, and he looked at his options and he said, well, a lot of money to be made in bootlegging, so I guess that's what I'm going to do. So he dove headfirst into the world of bootlegging. And he really approached it kind of like as a businessman. You know, when the Billingsleys were having shootouts on the streets and stuff during the first wave of Prohibition, he was on the force and he was watching all this, and he was making a lot of mental notes about what they were doing right, what they were doing wrong, their strengths, their weaknesses, that sort of thing. And he used that knowledge to create a very large-scale bootlegging operation. Within a couple years, his bootlegging operation was so big that he was Puget Sound's largest employer. That's how big is his bootlegging operation. He was large. When I say large, definitely the largest bootlegger in the area, and probably arguably the largest bootlegger in the country as far as the sheer amount of booze he was bringing in. The way his operation would work is how a lot of bootleggers here did it, which is you would hire rumrunners to go up to Canada where booze was legal. A lot of the rumrunners were kind of contractors for hire, so the bootleggers would hire them to bring their ships up to Canada, usually Victoria or Vancouver, and then they would load up their ships with as much booze as they can. As soon as national prohibition went into effect here, a lot of Canadian liquor companies got dollar signs in their eyes. So they were more than happy to help satisfy our demand for Canadian booze. So it was really easy if you're a rum runner. You just pull up. Basically, they had docks that you could just pull your boat up to, and they'd load you up, and away you would go. So Roy would hire rum runners to go to Canada. Eventually, he had his own fleet of ships. They would load up with liquor, and then they would smuggle it down to various landing spots along the intracoastal areas here in Puget Sound, you know, Bellingham, Everett, Edmonds, Seattle, Tacoma, and all points in between. Usually there would be a team of bootleggers to meet the boats, when they landed, and then they'd quickly load the booze on their trucks, and then they would bring it somewhere, usually a temporary holding place like a barn or a garage. Once it was there, they would then begin taking orders for all the speakeasies and private clubs and stuff throughout the city, whoever wanted the booze. It was usually weekly shipments they were getting, sometimes more depending on the demand, but that's generally how it worked. So he had the title as the king of the Puget Sound bootleggers because he was the big fish around here. He was also known as the gentleman bootlegger, and there were a few reasons for this. The main reason was that there was a lot of shady stuff going on during Prohibition as far as the black market liquor. There was a lot of people that were making their own booze just out of whatever garbage they could put together that could produce alcohol, you know, bathtub gin, that kind of thing. Really nasty stuff, and try to pass it off as legit booze. A lot of people were also using, denatured alcohol, industrial booze, and then adding flavorings and colorings to it, and then trying to pass it off as whiskey. And a lot of that stuff was toxic, so people were drinking this stuff and getting either really sick or dying from it. So with Roy Olmstead, you knew you were getting safe booze. That was a big deal back then. Not only were you getting safe booze, you were getting top shelf booze from Canada that was bottled and bonded and the whole bit. So people appreciated that about him. Also, he didn't engage in any other kind of vices, no prostitution, gambling, selling narcotics, nothing like that. He just stuck to liquor, meeting the liquor demand. Also, he didn't believe in violence. He didn't allow his men to carry guns. Another reason why he was the gentleman bootlegger. Again, he watched the Billingsley brothers during the first wave of Prohibition and saw them with all their shootouts and everything, and he was like, who needs that? That just brings a lot of unwanted attention to you. It's better just to pay people off. I'm making enough money from this, so he would just pay people off. If there's a problem, he would just throw money at it, and that usually handled it that way. This kind of gentleman bootlegger ethos was also just kind of how things operated around here. This area was really an anomaly compared to the rest of the country during Prohibition as far as the bootlegging and the black market booze goes. In other parts of the country, they're having shootouts with each other, gang wars over turf, people are ending up dead. It was pretty brutal and violent and bloody in a lot of places. Here, there was none of that. There wasn't these bootleggers were not having shootouts with each other. There was no violence. There was none of that. And I often get asked questions of why that was. Like, why was everyone so civil here where the rest of the country they weren't? And I don't really know for sure. I've never really been able to figure it out. I don't know if it's the Scandinavian influence, kind of laid back. Was it the Seattle freeze where the bootleggers didn't want to hang out and talk to each other, never mind having shootouts with each other? I don't know. If I had to take an educated guess, I would probably say it was Roy Olmstead's influence. I think he was the big fish here, and I think kind of how he ran things trickled down and people just kind of followed his example. So, but to give you an example of just how civil it was here, in 1922, there was a bootleggers convention at a downtown Seattle hotel where over 100 bootleggers showed up. Not only did 100 bootleggers show up and peacefully coexist at this convention, they used Robert's Rules of Order to democratically decide what the rules were going to be, as far as liquor prices and who's going to control which area and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, everyone around here was the gentleman bootlegger. Now, so that was kind of the rise of Roy Olmstead. Let's talk about the fall of Roy Olmstead. So Roy Olmstead was really only in operation for 5 years, from 1920 to effectively the end of 1925. So let's talk about that a little bit. So when Roy first started, he didn't really have too much to worry about as far as law enforcement and the authorities breathing down his neck. The feds hadn't initially set up here yet. They were focused on everything that was going on over on the East Coast and the Midwest. And we were like a backwater place, so initially we weren't even really on their radar. The only people he had to worry about were the Seattle Police Department, but again, half of the force was on his payroll. Even for those who weren't on his payroll, he was a former cop himself, so he knew their schedules. He knew, which streets not to be on at certain times, depending who was the beat cop that day, that kind of thing. So he didn't really have a lot to worry about. Sometime, I would say, late 1921, early 1922, suddenly the feds started getting wind that there was some major liquor operation going on here in the backwater place known as Seattle. So they sent out some federal agents to investigate it, and sure enough, they confirmed, Roy Olmstead had a major operation going on here. So they opened up an office in downtown Seattle, the Federal Prohibition Bureau. The head of the bureau was the assistant director, William Whitney. He was the de facto leader. He was the chief enforcer. Not a nice guy. None of the guys that he hired kind of these really thuggish guys. If there was any violence here during Prohibition, it was at the hands of him or his agents. They were, the Billy Club type, and Billy Club you and ask questions later, that kind of approach. So they were really unpopular here. And the local population didn't like the feds. The Seattle Police Department didn't like them. They were always butting heads. The mayor at the time, Edwin Brown, despised them. They were always having word of wars in the newspapers. So they were not popular here. So they didn't, initially when they first set up here, they had a really hard time trying to make any inroads as far as bringing down Roy Olmstead, because no one would cooperate with them. In most places you could find someone that was willing to be an informant. Not here in Seattle. Roy Olmstead, he was like a folk figure. Everyone loved him. So they would pull people in to try to get them to talk, and pretty much across the board, the response was, well, I'm not going to tell you anything about Roy. Kick rocks. Get out of here. You're not going to get anything from me. So he eventually had to resort to more unscrupulous methods. What he started doing is he started wiretapping Olmstead's phones, which was kind of a new thing back then, and no one was really doing it, but he was desperate to make some kind of case against Olmstead. So he started wiretapping his phones, but again, even that kind of fell on his face because the guy that he hired to wiretap Olmstead's phones eventually told Roy about it. Like, hey, you should probably know the feds are listening in. And Roy just made a game of it. Knowing that William Whitney was listening in on his phone calls, he started setting up fake deliveries. So he would talk to somebody on the phone as though there was a big delivery going on, and then Whitney and his agents would be staked out on some rainy, cold beach at night, waiting for a liquor delivery that would never show up, and Olmstead and his boys were, have a big laugh about it. He would also just continually insult Whitney, knowing that Whitney was going to hear it the next day when it was transcribed. Oh, William Whitney, that guy's a nincompoop. He couldn't think his way out of a paper bag. So, he just made it personal. Eventually, Whitney got tired of the games. It became personal. They were also at risk of losing their job because they had been here for probably over a year at this point, and they had made no progress. So the higher-ups in D.C. were like, what's going on? We got a huge liquor operation going on, and you guys haven't done a thing. Are you guys able to do this? Do we need to fire you and send somebody else in? So he was at risk of losing his job. So backed in a corner, he started resorting to even more unscrupulous methods. He started falsifying the wiretap transcripts. He started using intimidating witnesses into giving kind of like false testimony about stuff. And from all this, he was able to get a search warrant. And in November of 1924, with the search warrant, they raided Olmstead's house. Olmstead didn't know about it. It was a surprise raid, in fact, and Al's probably going to talk about this. When they raided his place, Elise was doing her famous radio show upstairs and was on the air, and suddenly the door burst open and agents are holding guns to her head and telling her to get off the air and stuff. They didn't find any booze at Olmstead's house. That's what they were hoping to get. There was zero booze, but they did find some incriminating paperwork. They also got one of Olmstead's, his right man hand, Al Hubbard, the subject of my second book, got him to flip on Olmstead in exchange for not having an indictment, being indicted. So with that, the case went to trial, and that was the beginning of the end for Olmstead. The trial that ensued from that, the Whispering Wires trial, very famous trial, lasted about a year. And during that time, Olmstead was still bootlegging, even during the trial. I think more to make money, because suddenly he had a bunch of legal bills. Even got arrested, during that time for bootlegging. But it was the beginning of the end. He was never able to recover from that, and eventually he ended up getting sentenced to prison. He did several years at McNeil Island Penitentiary. So that was the rise and fall of Roy Olmstead. Now, when I first started talking about Roy after the release of my first book, Seattle Prohibition, I would do presentations like this, and there would be questions and answer sessions afterwards. And initially, everyone was, asking about Roy, or maybe some of the Rumrunners, or Doc Hamilton and his famous speakeasy, things like that. But I noticed a definite shift probably 3 or 4 years ago. Suddenly, I started getting a lot more questions about his wife, Elise. There was suddenly a sudden interest in Elise. And that increased, and I could just see her stock rising. This was really driven home a couple years ago. KUOW reached out to me because they were doing a segment on the 90th anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition. And I'm the Seattle Prohibition guy, so whenever something like that comes up, they'll reach out to me. So they reached out, wanted to know if they can interview me, and I was like, sure, what do you want to talk about? You want to talk about the Rumrunners, the Roadhouses, Roy, whatever you guys want to talk about. And the interviewer was like, actually, I was hoping we could talk about Elise. So I said, okay, all right. And that's when I knew for sure her stock was rising. So over the years, it's been much less Roy, more Elise. Yeah, Roy is so 2010. Elise is really the it person right now. And understandably so, there's a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding Elise. She is a fascinating figure. And lucky for us, we had someone that kind of dove into her interesting story and did some deep research in it and made a really good book. When I say he did deep research, like I take pride in how far I go in my research, but he went deep, deep, deep. I mean, traveling the country, I think there was DNA testing at one point. It was, no stone was left unturned. So without any further ado, please give a warm welcome to Al Gadari.
Thanks, Brad. All those calls were from me, Brad. I wanted to write a book about Elise, and so I kept calling you. Elise is probably one of the most misunderstood public figures of that period. She's a fascinating woman, and one who I think has been overlooked for far too long. Resilient, obstinate, smart as could be. In fact, so smart there are a number of people who thought she ran Olmstead's operations. She was that smart. So smart that she hid code in her radio broadcasts on her radio show to tell the Rumrunners in their ships where to go to avoid the Coast Guard cutters as they were trying to track down the shipments. It just isn't true. It makes for a good story, but in fact, I think this would be a better title if we talked about the reluctant bootleggers instead of the bootleg royalty. I'm going to dial it back a little bit to June 1922, when Roy was arrested for the second time. It was a massive raid. 4 people in his group in Los Angeles rounded up. Roy himself arrested, his sergeant cohort arrested, and Whitney thought he had him nailed at this point. So the case was going to go to grand jury. The grand jury was going to roll up and have this massive success for the Western Washington Prohibition Office. And his lead witness, who knew everything about the operations of Olmstead's business, because they had been planted there as the bookkeeper for Roy's operation. And the grand jury set to convene. Whitney shows up, no witness. He has to tell the judge, we have to delay a little bit, but we'll be back within a month to have the grand jury indict all of these people. And of course, a month rolls around and nobody shows up. And Whitney has to admit that his witness, a woman, did not appear as expected. The woman, of course, is Elise. The Prohibition agents had planted her as his bookkeeper a year before or so, and she knew all of the operations of Olmstead from top to bottom. Now, it's not surprising that a smart, intelligent woman like that realizes the card she's holding and the man she's holding it at the table with, because Roy was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars a month and was living the life of royalty. So did she play the card and tell Roy, if you marry me, I can't testify because the marital privilege will prevent me from going to the grand jury? Or did they fall in love? We don't know, but I feel pretty strongly it's the latter case. I think she actually did fall in love. And a lot of the evidence for that comes a little bit later. So you saw the mansion a little earlier where the raid occurred. It's not something that was expected at the time. She was living the halcyon days. The money flowed like the waters of Puget Sound. She was happy as could be. She was a singer. She had orchestras at her house. She did opera. She was living a wonderful life. But she was a reluctant wife of a bootlegger. And I believe that when the raid occurred, it sent shockwaves through Roy and Elise's marriage. And I think it turned everything in a different direction than the plan that they had made together in 1922 to go straight, to regain Roy's respectability in the community, to allow him to resume a normal life, because he was a smart man. The corporatization of bootlegging eliminated the violence, as Brad alluded to, and it got all of the bootleggers together and convinced them that there was no need to shoot each other because they could make more money cooperating with each other. And he was a smart man, and I believe Elise saw that potential in him and fully intended to see their marriage go the respectable way. So what's the evidence for this? And let me stop for 1 second. This is the entryway to the mansion, and Elise coming down the stairs. And I'm going to run through a bunch of other photos to show you the grandeur they were living in at this point. So Whitney was so angry and so upset at the loss of his grand jury indictment that he set about what I think is a vendetta against Elise and Roy that was an obsession with him. And it took him almost a year to gather enough evidence through wiretapping and other means to prosecute Roy and convict him. But he was so scurrilous with Elise in what he did, and it's almost unbelievable, except for the times we live in. You might expect it. So the raid occurs, and in the next day in the newspaper is a lead story. Elise Olmstead was an informant. And the leak comes from the Prohibition office, and it explains to the public that they had an informant inside Roy's operation for over a year or so, giving them all the information. So first fact comes out, Elise is an informant. Second story, Elise is illegally in the country. She's not from here. She's from England or Canada, and she's subject to deportation. Third, she uses a bunch of different aliases known by Campbell, Potter, Aunt Vivian, and all of these names. And we all know that only criminals use aliases, right? And that's the implication of it. But most scurrilous of all, the fourth bomb, if you will. She abandoned a family in Canada, tarnishing her reputation as viciously as you could, and then pursuing an investigation into each of these points over the course of the next year as the case moved through grand jury indictment into trial. They indicted Elise, one of 99 others, the only woman, and on what evidence? As Brad mentioned, the wiretaps, they had over 700 pages of wiretap transcripts. And the way this worked is the agents would sit in the basement of the various places wiretapped, and there were a number of them, including Roy's home, where the tap occurred in the house next door in the basement of his neighbor. The agents would take notes. Then they would give it to Whitney's wife, who would type them up. And if she didn't quite understand something, she'd fill in the gaps. She knew who they were talking about. And so all of that work was done and compiled into a book of wiretap evidence, 700 pages long. Presented at trial, but never admitted. The judge required the agents to testify to the best of their recollection, and it would go something like this. I remember on this date, and then they would read basically what was written. A silly little act, but ultimately the Supreme Court upheld that wiretapping, and a lot of people don't realize that for 40 years thereafter, wiretapping was legal, and it was used broadly throughout the country. But at trial, the interesting thing was those 700 pages contained only 2 snippets of conversations where Elise's voice allegedly was recorded. And I say allegedly because the agents didn't know it was her or not. They filled in the name. You'd think they would have asked the question or pointed out in a British accent, the person said, because Elise had a lovely British voice. But they didn't. And so I think ultimately the reason Elise, having gone through this trial, having bested the lawyers in cross-examination, is acquitted, is because in fact there wasn't a shred of evidence that she was involved in the Prohibition rum running business of Roy. So when you look back over that trial, I think Elise acquits herself as the jury acquitted her. But in the process, she tried to get Roy to reveal who his backers were, to come clean, to leverage what Roy knew in order to lessen his sentence. But Roy wouldn't do that, even to get out of jail free, if you will. And who were the big people behind him? We really don't know. But we know Mr. Boeing took the stand and had to admit the amount of booze he was taking, Weyerhaeuser's, other big names in Seattle. So he certainly had quite a broad clientele. But Elise consistently was interested in doing things for culture and arts and music. She was involved in opera, in the Seattle Opera. She was the promoter of the radio station KFQX, which became Como, ultimately, and the innovation of being the first to record an orchestra live and broadcast it, to create advertising backing, to run news programs backed by advertisers. So she was a very smart woman, and she knew that she could make a fortune in this new business called radio with Roy's backing. And Roy was behind that plan. But, as he said later, I was too deep in. Once you're in for the money and it's easy flowing and then things go bad, you have to eat and you have to pay the bills. And so ultimately that raid in 1924 essentially ended his chance then of redemption and respectability. Roy ultimately went to prison. Take 1 second. Here in the piano room, Elise was a very accomplished musician. You'll notice Roy's office with his connected phones in the background, multiple phones on the desk, taking orders. And Roy, at the radio station, which was installed in his own, in one of the rooms in the mansion. And here's Elise actually reading her bedtime stories. She was so popular that the new Radio Digest was so excited by her, they put her on the front page of their magazine. And this is really where the future likely would have been for Roy and her. There's a couple of sidelights I'd love to get into if we had enough time, including a gold mine in California and a few other interesting enterprises. But you can read the book and you can get into a little bit more of that detail. Roy goes to jail. He's the only bootlegger that served a full sentence, 4 years on McNeil Island. He prospered there. He actually liked the hard work, and he did pretty well. Got high marks from the warden. They all loved him. He had an endless raft of visitors, mostly government people, hoping he would spill the beans on somebody else. He did give interviews to government agents. He did eventually talk about some of the workings of the business, but he never gave up the key people involved. And he did say in the end, because there are allegations that Whitney and others were on the take themselves and bribed themselves. They went to trial in 1930 on those bribery charges. Elise and Roy both gave grand jury testimony in those cases. And Roy said, they never took a dime from me. It's an interesting opportunity on his part to sink them. Now, he did say, I gave Hubbard money to give to them, but Hubbard, of course, took the money and put it in his own pocket. He was the shadiest of all shady characters. So Roy goes to jail for 4 years. In 1925, as the trial was about to start, Elise and Roy had their only child, Patricia. So here's Elise, pregnant, trial, has the baby, and after Roy goes to jail, Patricia is placed with a family who could raise her and a lovely Scottish family. And Elise has to go to work. She's industrious, hardworking, and resilient, and refused to give up. She was a nurse. We have no idea where her training was, but she was a private nurse until Whitney would let the word out that she was that Olmstead, and then she would lose that job. She was a traveling saleswoman. She worked in Utah selling products. We don't really know what she sold. She went to work for Pinkerton, which is not surprising, because one of the things about Elise, to circle back to my opening and main point, one of the things about Elise is she always was on the government side. She never really believed in illegality as a way of making money. She was happy to get the furs, she was happy to live in the mansion, but she never really supported the illegality. And her history as an informant actually goes back quite a ways. She was the daughter of a German butcher who had immigrated to England, and when World War I broke out, she was an informant within her community on anti-English sentiment. She always had a tendency towards law enforcement. And the one thing I think in Phil Metcalf's book on Prohibition that is exactly right is that she wanted to know everything about everybody, and she had the facility to work with those people and remember the facts and the details. And she used them with Roy to try to keep Roy out of more trouble. She was so resourceful, they were so broke, that she could raise money for his bonds after every arrest and after every appeal. And nobody knows where that money came from because they were flat broke. The mansion you saw after the conviction was sold and the contents auctioned off. In the book, there's a really lovely description of all of the things that she had picked out herself from around the world to decorate that home. And in fact, in the collection of materials that were kindly shared with me by John and his family, there's an inventory of everything in the house and its valuation, all right before the raid happens. And the amount of furs and jewelry and right down to her bloomers is a pretty amazing collection of things. So she certainly loved the fineries of life, but with her background and her history, how resilient was she? So let's just close with the last comment about her abandoning a family. She lost her father and her mother when she was just a teenage girl, taken care of largely by her older sister, and she lost her brother in World War I on the battlefield. So her and her sister would entertain the troops in Liverpool. And as an attractive, bright, young 17-year-old girl, I think the facts are pretty clear that she got pregnant. She boarded a ship at 18, probably against all of the wishes of her family, because they had no contact for another 20 years after this. She left and immigrated to Canada for the purpose of finding her husband. But she was never married. So she was going to find him in Vancouver, British Columbia. Now just think about that for a second. In 1919, a young woman, pregnant, probably about 5 months to 6 months, crossing the North Atlantic in a troop ship, essentially, landing in Montreal, boarding a new train, this new thing called the Canadian Pacific, out to Vancouver, British Columbia. That is one strong, determined, resilient young woman. Now, she has the child. The child is given up for adoption. And only one other person, her best friend, knew that story. And it's that best friend who ratted her out to Prohibition to get her husband a pass from extradition from Canada in trial in the Olmstead trial. So I think she learned never to trust anybody again. And the only person that she would have trusted through all of this was Roy. He knew she was an informant. She had to tell him that. He had to know the history. The aliases, the name Campbell is on her merit certificate. Campbell is the name of the soldier, the Canadian soldier. And so ultimately we were able to do a DNA test and determine that Patricia has a half-brother who passed away a number of years ago, and his son is a resident of Seattle. So Patricia's what would that be? Nephew? Is that right? Yes, nephew, thank you. And the tragedy is, Elise could have been, they lived maybe 4 blocks away. She could have walked by that child a dozen times and never known it. So in the end, I think it's a bit of a tragedy. She had the chance to make it right, and he had the chance to make it right. But the raid intervened, needs must, and here we are. The story ends a little better. When Roy got out, they got back together. Unfortunately, she wanted to change Roy for good. She changed for too good because he took up Christian Science. He became very active in the recovery of alcoholics and others. And, things didn't work out in the end. They divorced in 1943. She really wanted a more active life, and that's what she thought she was going to get. She loved the fur, she loved the cars, and all of that. She's very active in Seattle Opera, as I said. But she did take up, excuse me, yeah, it did fall, sorry. I'm impressed I can still get up and down. She did become very active in Patricia's school. In the end, I'm sorry, I should have stopped at the trial picture. This is on the steps of the courthouse after the first week of trial, and that's Roy's mother, Sarah, in the bottom there, and that's Elise in the very stylish outfit behind Roy. And another lovely portrait of her, and Roy's ultimate parole and pardon photo from McNeil Island. And in the end, I love this photo because it shows she prevailed. In the end, she became president of Summit Schools, PTA, for 6 years right here in Seattle, and championed playground for children against a lot of opposition for the funding of it by the municipality and the like. She remarried and went on through the rest of her life. And surprisingly, when I was able to track down John McFarlane, surprisingly, her notoriety had she faded into the past. And I was always surprised talking to John and his family and his brothers how little she spoke of it. But when you know Elise's history, she shared nothing after those early embarrassments, I think, and it was really difficult for her to talk about those days. So I'm going to ask John to come up and talk a little bit about what his experiences were growing up with Elise, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I'm sure you'll have a whole lot of them. John?
Well, our experiences with Elise were, as a grandson, it was just, it was a typical relationship between grandchildren and grandparents. We go visit for the holidays and meals together. It was nice. It was nice. She taught me how to set a table properly, and it had to be right. We enjoyed being with each other. Oftentimes, either my brother Mark or I would go on the city bus and go shopping with her. We'd go down to the Naval Station PX, do shopping. It was just really a simple time, and we really didn't know much about those things at our age, and very little about what Roy was doing. Also, Roy passed when I was 4 years old, and so most of my memories are basically through the eyes of my brothers, and so, and they were also young too. So I think that Roy would bake his salmon, and my brother said that was dry, and Roy wasn't a very good cook. And Mark said that Roy would come on Christmas time and bring us the newest and latest toys, just the best stuff you could get, what everybody wanted. And it really, my memories are basically through my brother's eyes on most of these things.
John, when did you learn about the history of your family?
Well, it was odd because we would hear a few things from my mother, and actually I would say the big one was, I may be wrong about the year, but I think it was Christmas Day 1976. The front page of the Seattle Times had a large article about Roy, and I was 14 years old, and I read through that, and I was a little amazed and shocked that all those things had gone on. I never ever spoke to my grandmother about those things, not making the connections. And actually, I would say I learned the most when I met Al, because he brought to light a lot more than I'd ever known. It's actually difficult to consider that your grandparents had done all of these things, and the history and the connections just weren't quite there. And it's an amazing story. I would say that it's brought a lot of good things into my life. And one of them is when I started dating. And I was dating this girl, and she wanted to know about my family, and I was, well, I'll try to impress her. I'll ask her, oh, have you ever heard of Roy Olmstead? Well, she had studied Roy Olmstead at UCI, and so, well, that kind of sealed the deal. We're married and have 2 children. So,
Well played. Why don't we open it up for questions?
So, John, you're amongst friends here. Who were Roy's backers? No, I know. No, I guess you answered my question, which was, did you know much growing up? And it sounds like you didn't.
no.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience. Oh, and if you don't mind to just let us know who you have a question for.
How about that? There we go. All right. The question is, I guess, for you, because the name Olmstead, I know it from the standpoint of the designer of parks and such, in the 1909 exhibition and all that. Any relation?
No, I get that question all the
figured you would.
time. In fact, someone wrote a really fantastic book about the Olmstead brothers who designed the park. She's in the audience today, Jennifer over there. She also gets the question all the time. No, there was no relation between the two of them.
So Brad and I are going to disagree completely on this.
Okay. Is there a relation?
There is. There's actually this group called the Olmstead Foundation. The Olmstead family, John's directly descends from the founding fathers of Hartford, Connecticut. The name is etched on the obelisk in the central plaza, and from that family, the garden designer Olmstead, much less interesting character, is
wait a minute.
is a distant cousin to John, but they are actually cousins. And for up until COVID, the Olmstead Foundation, about 150,000 strong, would have an annual picnic somewhere around the country where they would all get together. And there actually is a family history written that that details that. And in the back of my book, I have a long line.
Was that picnic with or without liquor?
With or without what?
Liquor.
Oh, I'm sure there was plenty of liquor in there. Roy's 5 times great-grandfather was Ebenezer Olmstead, who was a lieutenant in the Revolutionary War, and very successfully snuck over to the neighbor's farm and met his wife, and married her a year later. Was so successful he was named treasurer of the town, and then promptly thereafter absconded with all the funds. So that apple fell not too far from the tree for Roy. Ouch.
Thank you for the presentation. Love hearing about this. My question is for Brad. So wiretapping and the right to privacy. Can you comment on the lineage there, the constitutional right to privacy, and how that case had anything to do with it or not?
Yeah, I think probably Al's probably better suited. He's a lawyer. He probably knows the nuances of that case better. All I can say is that it was the Whispering Wires cases that resulted after Roy was arrested, was the first court case to test the legality of wiretapping. And after it, the lawyer who was representing Roy, George Vanderveer, who's also a very interesting character, it got up to the Supreme Court level. Do you want to speak more about that? I think you can explain it a lot better than I can.
It's actually the very first case as a privacy lawyer that I actually read. And that's how I met the Olmsteads. The case was so obvious in terms of a violation of your Fourth Amendment right to privacy, the ability to wiretap without a search warrant, let alone to manipulate the content of it and present it in court successfully, that Roy himself believed and said multiple times, this will never stand. There was a Washington state statute that prohibited wiretapping. And so he was a little more free than he should have been on the Whispering Wires because, in fact, the judge found no illegal search and seizure. And the concept at the time, the Supreme Court opinion written by Justice Taft, was that when you voluntarily project your voice over a telephone wire outside the house, the Fourth Amendment can't apply to something like that. It only applies to search and seizure of papers and physical things within the house. There's a 5-4 decision, Justice Brandeis writing for the dissent, in what became probably his most famous dissent, saying, what happens in the future when the government possesses greater skills, perhaps reading your mind, finding things in your closet? This must be a search and seizure. It by definition is. And it took till 1966 before the Supreme Court overturned Olmstead. And really the Omnibus Crime Control Act of 1968 codified the procedures that requires a judge to approve each and every wiretap, to review at 10 days how successful it's going before it can continue. And so the process is a lot better today than it was back then.
Thank you.
Hi, we have a question from our live stream audience on YouTube. They would like to know if Elise ever mentioned her sister or spoke of her.
So I've surmised that Elise's decision to have the baby and travel to the New World was the source of a schism within the family. And it really was 20 years before anybody in the family connected again. Her sister Lily, who married a merchant marine man and moved to Philadelphia in 1921 or so, and her brother, her youngest brother, Carl, tracked her down in Seattle. And as far as I know, there were Christmas cards, occasional letters, but not any real substantial communication. Now, some of that may be because Roy was in jail. Some of it may be because Elise was working. Then World War II intervened, and so on. But you know, John, do you want to mention Patricia's trip east? Do you?
Well, yeah, I know that at some point my mother was a teenager and made the trip by train to Philadelphia to spend, I believe, a summer with Lily. And that was something that she still remembers today. And so oftentimes her memory's not that great. But she remembers all the things from probably 1970 and back pretty well. So that's something that's really stuck out in her mind.
I will say that when I first interviewed Patricia, and she mentioned traveling at 14 years old alone across country in the 1930s to visit Aunt Lily, Patricia knew the address and told me the address. She is sharp as can be and just an amazing woman. There's probably, I would say that the interesting, Lily's child was named Elise. Elise named her child Elise. That child named her child Elise in one more generation. So we've got 5 Elise generations, 5, and I believe it's 5. And Elise Likens was actually going to join us tonight, but a tragedy in her family kept her from coming to the West Coast. So I think the good thoughts for her on this. I know she would have been fascinated by this, but so obviously there was some memory and recognition of Elise within the family, but how much communication, we just don't really have a record. Elise did not keep much. She was extremely private, destroyed a lot of things later in her life and didn't want them shared. And that, of course, was her choice. So we have a lesser record of it. But.
Hi, guys. How are you? Thank you for being here. This is such an amazing time for me personally. My question is for Brad. Read your Prohibition book. It's incredible. I am curious if you have any information on the discovered murals of the Louisa Hotel.
Oh, yeah.
And the progress on that, Tenderloin and whatnot.
Yeah, so the question is about the murals at the Louisa Hotel. So the Louisa Hotel is a famous building in the Chinatown district, International District in Seattle. It was under a renovation project a number of years ago. In fact, when I was writing my book, during the renovation project, they uncovered kind of a hidden space that had been sealed off for a number of years. And when they went in there into the space, they discovered it was a one-time club, and there were these incredible murals that had been painted on the walls on the stairwell going down, as well as the downstairs club era. And they were definitely from the 20s, just based on the dress and the way the people were dressed and everything. So it made the newspapers. I was able to help shed some historical light on it because I just happened to be researching a raid that took place there during Prohibition when all this happened. So it was really exciting to be part of. As far as I know, so it's kind of gone back and forth for a while there. They were thinking the walls that the murals are on are old, like plaster, and they're in really bad shape. And so for a while there, they didn't think they were going to be able to maintain them. Like it was just too unstable. But it sounds like that's changed. So they're still there, and I don't know what they're doing, what process they're doing, but the hope is that they're going to be able to apply some kind of process to keep them there and turn the space into some kind of cool space. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Follow-up question.
Yes.
Sorry, follow-up question. is it the supposed location of the historic quote-unquote bucket of blood?
Yeah, it was referenced that. So it was under a couple different names as a club. It was a gambling club, and it was also a speakeasy. And bucket of blood was kind of a general term they used for speakeasies back there, and kind of like saloons and whatnot. It was a common term you'd hear come up every so often. So the bucket of blood wasn't its official name. It was just kind of a general term they used for it. Supposedly, it was because they served these drinks in these copper containers, and it looked kind of like blood, so they got the name the bucket of blood, but I don't know if that's true or not. Yeah.
Speaking of hotels, Brad,
Yeah.
is the hotel that the Bootleggers convention held at still around?
No, it's not. It's been
Which-
torn down, unfortunately. And is that Roy on your shirt, by the way?
Yes.
That is super cool. Where did you get that?
Isn't that cool?
That is really cool.
Yeah, it's a good shirt.
Yeah.
Smith Tower.
Oh, really? Okay, okay. Yeah, that's awesome.
In the gift shop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like 8 years ago.
Yeah, no, so I looked into this hotel hoping it was still around, and I forget the name of the hotel, but it was torn down at some point, I think in the 60s. Yeah, good question, though.
Hi, I have a question for Brad.
Yes.
Prohibition didn't actually end until the Roosevelt administration in 1932, although my understanding is it was not much enforced after about 1930, but there's still a gap there after quite a few years. Just very generally, what happened to the market for booze, and did the violence come in the way it had permeated other parts of the country?
Now, so as far as your question, are you talking about what happened to the market of booze after the repeal of Prohibition?
I'm sorry, no, after the repeal of Roy Olmstead.
Oh, after the repeal. Okay, so after Roy Olmstead went to prison, what happened? No, that's a great question. So when Roy went to prison, that was pretty much the end of the classic era of bootlegging here. No one bootlegger rose up to take his place, which you'd kind of think would happen. But at that point, the feds had really clamped down on things. So there were small little bootleggers still operating on very small scale. Like they might go up to Canada and get, like a couple cases of booze as opposed to shiploads of booze when Roy was in operation. And a lot of times they'd get caught. Likewise, out on the waters, the Coast Guard had really clamped down on all the rum runnies. So there were still rum runners going back and forth between Canada, but not on the scale of like what happened in the early 20s. So the main source of booze post-1925 here in Seattle, a lot of it was moonshining, a lot of moonshining operations, good ones, some good ones emerged, and that was the main source for the most part for the black market booze. A lot of it came from Aberdeen. Aberdeen was one of the nation's largest moonshining operations. It was up there with Appalachia, believe it or not, because of all the hills and stuff up there. And there were also some big moonshine operations on the outskirts of Tacoma and Seattle too. So that's what happened. Yes.
I understand from what you said that Roy was one of the biggest employers.
Mm-hmm.
What became the biggest employer after him when he went to prison?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I would probably venture to guess it was a Boeing aircraft would emerge later. I don't know at what point they became the largest, but probably after Roy Olmstead's operation, they would be the next biggest employer here in the area, because that's after World War I is when they kind of started building up and became a big, powerful Air Force company, or aircraft company, excuse me.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My question's for Al. I was wondering if you had any other personalities or characters that are intriguing you for another book. I really enjoyed the first one.
That's a good question.
I'm working on a book about Brad Holden right now because he is just tireless. If I have another idea from Western Washington, I'm going to give it to Brad. You know, this whole Olmstead crew are fascinating. His lead captain was named Prosper Granick. I love that name. And he was fifth generation Orcas Islander, swamp boat, could go through any storm and deliver the mail, so to speak. You already mentioned the nightclub owner. So many characters in it, but no, I'm retired. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer. Brad's a historian, and he's prolific. But thank you for the hint. Let me just say one thing about Boeing, by the way. Roy built a ship and named it the Elsie. It was a 100+ foot yacht built in the Lake Union Boat Works. And at the same time, the government had funded in the same boat works a dozen Coast Guard runners to go fast and track down his boats. The Elsie, in order to make sure it went fast enough, was outfitted with 3 Boeing jet engines. And was a little poorly naval architected on the first run, so they had to take one of those engines out and then right the keel. And Prosper Granick taking it out with 2 of Roy's Canadian warehousemen on board, having just had dinner on the way back to Vancouver. The other 2 engines caught fire and it sank just off Alki. So,
yeah, I've always been surprised that more kind of underwater explorers haven't come here to Puget Sound to find all these old shipwrecks from the Prohibition era, because there's hundreds of them out there.
right.
I've always been surprised about that.
Although they did disappointingly find a case of Prohibition liquor in Edmonds, I think it was, right?
Oh,
and,
yeah, it was all...
And it was not
Yeah,
fit, not fit for drink.
not good. Yeah,
This question, I guess, be for you, Brad.
okay.
Did the Smith Tower figure into the bootlegging business?
Yeah, in some ways. So when Roy and Elise set up their radio station, they were originally operating it from their home. And at some point, I believe they set up, and you maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Al, they set up an antenna to get better coverage up in the Smith Tower. I think they even recorded some of their shows there. Yeah. Also, Roy Olmstead's lawyer had an office up in the Smith Tower. So Roy was up there frequently visiting his lawyer. Yeah. So yeah, it does play a role.
Roy and Elise became local agents in the interlude between his conviction and going to jail for a gold mine in California that was backed by L.C. Smith, the builder of Smith Tower.
There you go.
Interesting connection.
Nobody else?
Sure.
I'm curious to hear why prohibition as a topic for you all. I have my reasons for, like, 4 constitutional amendments connected to it. What are your reasons?
So, as a data privacy lawyer, as I mentioned, the Olmstead case was foundational for the work I did. I represented most of the communications and internet companies in responding to government surveillance requests. So when I started reading about this, it was a story that was compelling. So then I started to get all the briefs, and then I learned that AT&T, for example, was an amicus brief filer in the original Olmstead case, arguing against the government's ability to attach things to their wires. Outlandish that the government would think they could put alligator clips on their wires. And I just started collecting, and the information isn't so much about Prohibition, and I'm anything but an expert on Prohibition. I read Brad's books for that. You know, it was really the story of Roy, and then ultimately I fell in love with Elise. I mean, she was just such a compelling figure that I just, not through any fault of anybody who wrote the prior books. Norm Clark in the 60s took the UW master's work that had been done on Roy and turned it into a really good book. But it was completely dismissive of Elise and completely wrong in terms of who was the informant. He contended it was Roy's first wife, Cotty, which is not true. And you know, a minor mistake like that, and it just kind of got me going. And then Phil Metcalf, sad story, he passed away, and his wife and father-in-law completed the book, but that also had a good number of errors, naturally. I mean, you know, he was the researcher in it, and so I felt like when I read the newspaper article after the raid that made the allegations against Elise, I set the wiretapping stuff aside and said I just really had to look more into Elise at that point. So that's the journey in short.
Yeah, and so for me, God, where do I begin? So it happened a number of years ago. One of the things I like to do on my off time is I like to go search for little historical artifacts, like at, you know, flea markets and estate sales and stuff. And so I was doing that, and I was at an estate sale. God, it's probably been, you know, over a decade ago at this point. I was at an estate sale in Ballard, and I was looking around, and I found the remnants of an old copper moonshine still down in the basement. I was like, this is really cool. And I knew what it was. I knew enough about Prohibition and stuff to know what it was. And so I was like, if this is down here, you know, what else could be down here? So I started rooting around, and I found a box of documents that basically told the story of this moonshine still that I found, which is the original owner of it was indeed using it during Prohibition to make moonshine for the local neighborhood. He was the local neighborhood supplier, eventually got popped and went to jail. And it just got me thinking, well, what did happen here during Prohibition? Because usually in popular media and stuff, when Prohibition comes up, it's like Chicago, St. Louis, New York. You never hear anything about the Pacific Northwest or Seattle. So it got me thinking what happened here. So I started researching it and went down the rabbit hole and spent a few years researching it. And I realized there was like a really cool story that had happened here that had never been told before. So I was like, well, I'd like to set out and document that, and that resulted in my book, Seattle Prohibition. So that's how I got into it. It was almost kind of by accident. Yeah.
Got one last one.
I do have another question. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Really interested in the association with Al Hubbard. Like, he was discovered by Roy, known for his ingenuity. He did set up that radio station. Less of a direct question, more kind of an open-ended question between you guys. Can you talk more about the association between Roy and Elise and Al?
Talk about the association between Roy and Elise, or Roy and Al?
Roy and Elise and Al.
Oh, Roy and Elise and Al. So boy, it's a tangled web, their relationship, and I don't know if I've ever satisfactorily untangled all the nuances of the relationship. But basically, in a nutshell, Al Hubbard, for those who don't know, was this very eccentric kind of mad scientist guy, I guess is a good way to describe him. Also a bit of a hustler, not a bit of a hustler, a big hustler. In let's see, what year was that? Late 1900s, he came up with his invention, the atmospheric power generator that he created here in Seattle. And supposedly it could extract energy from the atmosphere and use it to create power, like, you know, store power like a battery. And he held a demonstration of this atmospheric power generator on Lake Union, powered a boat on Lake Union, supposedly using this atmospheric power generator. And this was during the age of all these big inventors, you know, Tesla and Henry Ford and the Wright brothers and all these big inventions were coming out, changing the world. So the press got a hold of this, and it was like nationwide news. And he was the boy wizard. He was only, I think, 18 years old when he created this thing. And of course, he was a big deal here. So he did that. Not too long after National Prohibition starts, him and Roy meet each other. According to some accounts, Al was running a radio shop. Radios were kind of a new thing. People were buying them and setting them up in their homes. And so he was kind of capitalizing on that. So he had in downtown Seattle, he had a radio shop where you could go in and buy a radio for your home. And Roy was looking to get a tech guy on his crew to help his operation, like a communications guy, somebody that can put radios and stuff aboard his ships and his trucks to help him along. So according to the popular account, from what I've been able to see during my research, Roy recruited Al to come join him. Al, like I said, was a hustler. And when Roy met him, he was in debt. He was married, he had a newborn baby, they were living in some kind of dumpy apartment. His atmospheric power generator, it never really lifted off the ground. He was never able to make the money off it I think he was hoping to make. So when Roy approached him, he got dollar signs in his eyes, and he said, sure, I'll join you. Pay off my debts, I get a monthly salary, and I get to come live at your estate down in the basement, and that'll be my workshop. And so that's what he did. So he came on and joined Roy's operation as kind of his tech guy. He quickly became his right-hand man in his operation, started going on rum running journeys up to Canada and stuff. Really enjoyed that lifestyle. When Roy and Elise decided to build their radio station, he was the guy that built it for them. And then after Roy got arrested after the raid, Al was there the night of the raid. And basically he decided to become an informant once the indictments were handed out in exchange for having his indictment dropped. He also demanded to be made a Prohibition agent. They were desperate to get Roy, so they were like, okay. So then he became a Prohibition agent, was working both sides, making money from both sides. You know, he was one of those guys. And yeah, he really betrayed Roy. The big question, though, is did Roy know that he betrayed him? Because after it was disclosed in the papers, there was still a relationship between them. They were still operating together, and that's always intrigued me. Like, why? Why didn't Roy dump him? Was Roy just loyal to him to some degree? I'm not really sure. I've never been able to really figure that part out. But yeah, Al's an interesting guy. In the 50s, he would go on to become a revolutionary in psychedelic therapy. They called him the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. He created the template for psychedelic therapy, which is very popular now. On an island up in the San Juans, Damon Island, it was the birthplace of psychedelic therapy. So he's a fascinating guy, definitely a shyster, a hustler to the very end, but a fascinating guy nonetheless. Yeah, you want to add anything about the Al Hubbard story?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is that Elise did not like him, did not trust him.
Yeah, and rightfully so.
Yeah, but I think it says a lot about Roy's capacity for forgiveness that, you know, after everything, after all the disclosures, they met in the U.S. Attorney's office before his trial, shook hands and asked how it was going. So maybe that's just testament to his character and explains a lot how he and Elise could stay together and as well, I think, because Roy had a big heart.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. All right. Well, I think that's it. So,
everyone, please give our speakers a warm round of applause. And if you'd like to get a copy of Al's books, they are for sale in the Mohai Mercantile, so you can get one over here. And then we'll take this screen down, and there's a table right behind us if you'd like to get that book signed. So please do consider making that purchase. If you'd like to join us again, our next History Cafe is on June 18th. That was great. A Waterfront Without Wobblies by Connor Casey. And then please join us on June 10th, which is a Tuesday, for a special event from our corner of the world, Seattle's Solidarity Against South African Apartheid, with organizers from the Seattle Coalition Against Apartheid. And if you would like to get a not sold in stores, one-of-a-kind postcard from the back here, you can fill out a survey and we'll give you a lovely postcard. Yeah, and I think that's about it. So thank you very much and have a great evening.
Yeah, good job.